The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical hymn as Rachel Torres pushed through the double doors of Seattle General's ICU at 6:38 a.m., 11 minutes before the morning briefing. She kept her head down, kept her breathing even, kept the broken chain beneath her scrubs pressed against her ribs where no one could see it, where the single dog tag of her late husband caught the pale dawn light filtering through the hallway windows. The tag had been cold this morning when she'd touched it in the darkness of her apartment. Still was cold the way Bagram got after the sun fell behind the Hindu Kush. The ICU smelled like it always did, antiseptic layered over something deeper, something that clung to the walls no matter how many times housekeeping scrubbed. Bleach and copper and the faint sweetness of saline drips. Rachel's practical shoes made no sound on the tile. She'd learned that habit a long time ago, when stealth mattered more than comfort. The other nurses glanced up as she passed, but not at her face. They never did. Just saw another temp agency nurse, somebody filling a gap in the schedule, a body to turn charted orders into bedside care. Interchangeable. Forgettable. The way she needed to be. She made it to the chart station without speaking to anyone. Coffee sat cooling in a half-empty pot on the counter, and someone had left a box of stale donuts that no one was touching. Rachel opened the first patient file without hesitation, her eye scanning columns of numbers like a language she'd learned years ago. Vital signs. Enzyme levels. Blood cell counts. Each number told a story if you knew how to listen. Pain was information. She'd learned that in a field hospital with no anesthesia and casualties lined up on stretchers made from cargo pallets. These numbers sang the same way. 8-year-old Emma Reeves was in Bay 4. Rachel had been assigned to her care for the last 3 shifts, the ones most nurses avoided because the case was complicated and the outcome looked predetermined. Acute leukemia. Aggressive. The kind that made parents sit in waiting rooms with their eyes fixed on nothing, hoping for miracles that didn't exist. Emma's father was Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reeves, SEAL Team 3, currently deployed somewhere Rachel's security clearance no longer allowed her to know about. The girl had been admitted 6 weeks ago, and in that time, 15 different doctors had added their names to her chart. 15 specialists. 15 egos. 15 opinions that somehow all agreed on the same treatment protocol: maximum chemotherapy, maximum pressure, maximum everything. Rachel pulled Emma's file closer and tilted the page toward the window light. Her forearm shifted, and the scar there caught briefly in the fluorescent glare, a thin white line that ran from wrist to elbow, jagged as a lightning strike. She covered it quickly with her sleeve. The scar had a story. All her scars did. But stories were the luxury of people with names in databases. What she saw in Emma's numbers made her pause. The liver enzymes were climbing. Bilirubin at 2.8. ALT at 187. Albumin trending down. Those numbers didn't match the white blood cell response. They shouldn't be doing this together. The aggressive chemotherapy was designed to murder the cancer cells, yes, but the liver numbers suggested something else, something the protocol wasn't accounting for. Rachel had seen this pattern before. Once. At Bagram, during a treatment crisis in the surgical tent, when a blood product had contaminated and fall-line and a patient went into cascade failure because nobody was reading the signals correctly. She'd been the one holding pressure to stop the bleeding. The officer in charge had ignored her observations for 42 minutes. The patient coded. Twice. They brought him back the second time. She made a note in the margin of Emma's chart in her precise, clinical handwriting. Just the facts. Just the pattern. Just a question: enzyme elevation suggests hepatic stress response. Query metal sensitivity to port material? Request childhood allergy panel review. The note sat there on the page like a small stone dropped into still water. Rounds began at 7:15 a.m. Dr. James Caldwell arrived with the gravity of a man who'd never been questioned in his professional life. He was 56, carrying himself with the particular confidence that came from decades of privilege, Princeton undergraduate, Johns Hopkins Medical School, private practice until he'd been recruited to the hospital's oncology department 3 years ago with a salary that probably exceeded the annual budget of some countries. His shoes cost more than Rachel earned in a month. His watch was a Rolex Daytona, and he wore it like a threat. He had his residents arranged around him like courtiers, all younger, all eager to agree with whatever he said. Rachel stood to the side of Emma's bed, Emma's chart in her hands, her expression neutral. This was the arrangement in hospitals everywhere. Physicians spoke, nurses listened, and the hierarchy was written in the building's bones. Dr. Caldwell reviewed Emma's vitals with brisk efficiency, his eyes moving across the monitor screens. The heart rhythm was stable. Oxygen saturation acceptable. Blood pressure within acceptable range for a child in her condition. He nodded once, satisfied, and began to speak. "Continue the current chemotherapy protocol," he said to the assembled residents, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "The numbers are responding. We increased the dose by 0.5 milligrams per kilogram on Wednesday. Standard escalation." One of the residents wrote the order down. Nobody questioned it. Nobody looked at the liver enzymes. Nobody noticed that Emma had lost 4 more ounces since yesterday, that her appetite had vanished completely, that something deeper was happening beneath the surface of the standard treatment curve. Rachel's jaw tightened. Just a fraction. Just enough that anyone who knew how to read a person might have noticed the shift in her posture, the subtle tension that came from restraint, from not speaking, from keeping 1,000 observations locked behind her teeth. Her hands, the ones that had held together a field hospital in Bagram with a combat knife and prayer and sheer will, remained perfectly still. She stepped forward. Quietly. "Dr. Caldwell, may I ask about the enzyme trend?" The room went dead silent. Dr. Caldwell turned to look at her. Really look at her, for the first time. His expression shifted from professional neutrality to something closer to mild annoyance, the way someone might regard an insect that had the audacity to move across his desk. "Yes?" "Emma's liver function has been declining over the last 72 hours, Rachel said. Her voice was steady, clinical, the way she'd been trained. No emotion. No presumption. Just information. AST and ALT are both trending upward. Albumin is dropping. The chemotherapy protocol should still be effective, but the secondary markers suggest hepatic stress that isn't reflected in the standard oncology measures. Has there been a metal sensitivity screening? Given the port material and the... You're a nurse, Ms. He paused. Looked at the badge on her chest like it was irritating him. Torres. A temporary nurse, if I'm reading the agency designation correctly. You're here to manage medications and monitor output. Not to provide diagnostic opinions. One of the residents smiled. Not in a friendly way. I'm not providing an opinion, Rachel said. I'm noting a pattern in the clinical data. Emma's file shows 15 physicians have reviewed this case. I thought additional observations might be. Might be what? Dr. Caldwell's voice had dropped into that register that made people uncomfortable. Helpful? You don't have a medical degree, Ms. Torres. You have a nursing diploma and a temporary assignment. There is a difference between observation and diagnosis. A significant difference. The kind of difference that gets people sued. He turned back to Emma's bedside, dismissing Rachel entirely. His residents followed his lead like iron filings attracted to a magnet. The conversation moved on to other patients, other protocols, other decisions that were clearly above the pay grade of someone who simply made sure the 4 lines didn't get infected. Rachel stood perfectly still. She didn't flinch. Didn't look away. Didn't feel her face flush with anger or humiliation because those were luxuries, and she'd learned long ago that luxuries got people killed. The dog tag beneath her scrubs felt colder against her ribs. She refocused on the numbers. Always the numbers. The numbers didn't care about hierarchy or credentials or the particular way certain men looked at nurses like they were furniture. Emma's liver was trying to tell a story. The white cells told another. They didn't match. And when patterns didn't match, something was always wrong. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she knew. Rachel Torres knew exactly what was happening in Emma's small body. She'd seen it before. She'd held patients through it. She'd lost soldiers to it, and for 3 seconds, 3 separate heartbeats, she let herself remember the exact moment when understanding came too late and death followed. It was a memory that belonged to someone else now, someone who no longer existed in any military database. Someone with a rank she wasn't permitted to claim and a name that had officially died in a transport accident. The morning briefing continued. Dr. Caldwell assigned his residents to various patients. One of them would watch Emma's labs. Another would manage the escalated chemotherapy protocol. None of them would connect the enzyme trends to anything beyond the standard oncological progression. None of them had been trained to see what Rachel saw because none of them had sat in field hospitals where pattern recognition meant the difference between life and exsanguination. Rachel finished her notes at 8:53 a.m. She made a copy of Emma's chart for the shift change briefing, and she placed her observations directly beneath the clinical vitals where they couldn't be missed. Then she returned to her station, opened the half-empty coffee pot, poured herself a cup, and didn't ask for permission because she was already invisible, and invisible people didn't need to ask. The coffee was cold. Tasted like burnt metal. She drank it anyway, her eyes fixed on Emma through the bay window. The little girl was sleeping, her face smaller somehow in the hospital light, her blonde hair splayed across a Disney princess pillowcase someone had brought from home. Probably her father had bought that pillowcase. Probably he'd imagined he'd bring her home still wearing it. Rachel pressed her hand against the cold stainless steel of the counter and didn't let herself think about any of that. Feelings were data. Feelings told you what mattered. And what mattered right now was that Emma's pattern didn't match the diagnosis, and Dr. Caldwell had made it clear that observing patterns was above her pay grade. She had no idea what was about to walk through those hospital doors. The supply closet was barely 6 feet wide, crowded with cardboard boxes of saline bags and stacks of sterile drapes that smelled of chemicals and something older, dust from before Rachel arrived. Dr. Caldwell closed the door behind them with a kind of quiet that made her spine recognize an authority figure about to weaponize his position. She had felt this before. Not in a supply closet, but in a Bagram command tent when a superior officer wanted to break someone without witnesses. The fluorescent strip light hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular hospital pallor that made skin look like it belonged to corpses. "You're a temp nurse questioning my protocol." His voice wasn't loud. That was the thing about truly powerful men, they didn't need to raise their voice. The words landed like shrapnel. "I have 15 doctors on this case who agree with me." 15. You understand what that means? 15 MDs, and you think you spotted something they missed because you can read a liver panel. Rachel kept her expression neutral, the way she'd learned in triage when soldiers screamed and she couldn't afford to flinch. She had questioned protocols before, in operating theaters where the difference between hesitation and confidence meant the difference between someone's son coming home or coming home in a flag-draped box. But this wasn't Bagram. This was Jacksonville, Florida, and she was just a temp. "I apologize, doctor. I was only..." "Only what?" "Practicing medicine?" He stepped closer, and she caught the sharp tang of coffee on his breath, the cologne he wore like a second uniform, something expensive that cost more than Rachel's weekly rent. "I've already called your staffing agency about your performance. They're not happy with how you're fitting into our culture. Your contract is up for review at the end of the month." Rachel took one measured breath through her nose. Her hands remained steady at her sides. Under her scrubs, the dog tag on the broken chain felt heavier than it should, Michael's tag, worn so thin in places that the engraving was barely visible anymore. She had carried it for 3 years without anyone noticing. A single piece of her old identity, hidden where it couldn't be used against her. "Emma's liver enzymes tell a different story than her white count," Rachel said quietly, meeting his eyes. "But you're the one with the medical degree here." It wasn't a challenge. It was the most submissive thing she could have said, and she meant every word of it. but she also knew he would hear it as defiance, because men like Caldwell heard anything that wasn't complete agreement as rebellion. He stared at her for 3 seconds, long enough for her to see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was deciding if she was worth firing now or if he wanted to make an example of her first. He chose the example. That afternoon, the overhead page crackled through the hospital with a sound like bones breaking in a closed fist. Most of the staff didn't even register it. Rachel heard her name and something else, a nickname so juvenile it almost made her smile if her face could still do that without calculation. Rachel the rent-a-nurse to the parking lot. Rachel the rent-a-nurse to the parking lot. She found him standing beside his Mercedes, a steel grey sedan that probably cost more than she'd make in 5 years, and he had timed it perfectly. The shift change was assembling like a congregation gathering for someone else's funeral. 30 nurses, maybe more, streaming toward the employee lot with their phones in hand and their exhaustion written across their faces in permanent marker. They slowed when they saw him. Caldwell had that effect on people, the presence that made the air pressure change. Effective immediately, he announced, loud enough that every departing nurse could hear, "You're off ICU rotation. Floor duty only. When temps overstep, there are consequences." Rachel felt every eye shift toward her like a spotlight. She saw the whispers start, saw the pity and the schadenfreude mixing in equal measure on 30 different faces. This was stage 3 of the humiliation, not the private threat in the supply closet, but the public dismantling. Caldwell understood institutional power the way some men understood how to control a room. He wasn't just demoting her from the ICU. He was broadcasting to every single person in that parking lot that the temp nurse had tried to challenge him and lost. Her hands remained steady. Her jaw didn't clench. She absorbed each word like a soldier absorbs intelligence briefing before a drop zone insertion, useful information, to be filed and processed and never used against you. She turned and walked toward her Honda without responding, without the satisfaction of even a backward glance. The other nurses parted slightly as she passed, the way crowds do when someone is visibly catastrophic. She didn't see Caldwell walk back inside. She didn't see him reach for his phone before he'd even entered the main entrance. That call would reach the nursing board before Rachel's car even pulled out of the lot, a formal complaint about her conduct, her insubordination, her dangerous lack of respect for medical hierarchy. By the time she merged onto the interstate, there would be an official inquiry pending. By morning, there would be a written warning in her personnel file, the kind of mark that follows you from agency to agency, hospital to hospital, city to city. Rachel gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the way she'd been taught at Fort Sam Houston when she was still Rachel Torres and not just Rachel the rent-a-nurse. The Honda's air conditioning wheezed like a patient with fluid in their lungs. The radio was off. The only sound was the engine and the soft metallic clink of Michael's dog tag against her collarbone. She'd moved it from beneath her scrubs, needed to feel it against her skin where it belonged. 3 years. She had kept her head down for 3 years. She had answered to names that weren't hers, taken insults that were designed for the person she wasn't anymore, accepted the smallest assignments with gratitude she didn't feel. The Pentagon had been very clear about the terms of her new life: keep your mouth shut. Use the cover story. Testify when called. Disappear back into civilian life and never surface again. You're officially dead, Major Torres. Officially, that transport accident in Bagram took everyone in that Chinook. Your family has a memorial service scheduled. Your name is on a wall at Arlington. Congratulations on your new life. But Emma Reeves wasn't a testifying witness scheduled for a tribunal. Emma Reeves was an 8-year-old girl who was turning gray under aggressive chemotherapy that was actively poisoning her, and the one person who knew it in the same bone-deep way that Rachel knew how to perform a field thoracotomy with a combat knife, was now assigned to floor rotations where she wouldn't see the little girl again. Rachel pulled into the parking garage at her apartment complex and sat in the darkness for 5 minutes, her hand still on the wheel. She touched the dog tag and let herself think for exactly the duration it took to take one breath in and one breath out. Then she was moving, climbing the stairs to her studio apartment, changing out of her scrubs, and opening the notebook she kept in the back of her locker. 2 weeks of observations about Emma Reeves. 2 weeks of patterns that Emma's own father didn't know his daughter was developing. The rain started around midnight, hammering the thin walls of her apartment like applause for a performance that nobody was supposed to witness. Rachel sat on her bed with the notebook open and Michael's dog tag cold in her palm, thinking about the difference between following orders and following conscience, between staying dead and coming alive. The problem with being officially dead was that nobody expected you to take risks. Nobody expected the person they thought was just a temp nurse to break protocol, to step outside the walls they'd drawn around her life, to remember that she had been trained for something much harder than this. But that was also the advantage. Caldwell had made his move, had used his 15 doctors and his institutional power to push her down and out. He thought she would stay down. What he didn't know was that Major Rachel Torres had survived worse. What he didn't know was that the woman in scrubs had held together a field hospital during the Bagram siege while shrapnel painted the walls and people screamed for mothers in languages she didn't speak. What he didn't know was that she would break her entire new life, would burn her cover and her identity and every compromise she'd made in 3 years, for one little girl who was running out of time. But that wasn't the worst part of what he didn't know. The fluorescent lights above the pediatric floor hummed their endless mechanical song, and Rachel had learned to hear them as a countdown. 2 weeks. 14 days of watching Emma Reeves from a distance measured in door frames and observation windows, calculating decline in the way her body had calculated blood loss in field hospitals where the math meant survival or flag-draped boxes. Emma's bed was in the corner isolation room now. Caldwell had made that change on day 3 of Rachel's reassignment, moved the girl away from the central nurses' station where Rachel might linger too long, might ask questions, might do anything but push medication carts and empty bedpans on the general floor. The reassignment was punishment dressed in hospital policy. The restriction was something sharper. Rachel had watched from the hallway as they installed the new door code. She'd seen Caldwell instruct the ICU charge nurse, Margot, with words spoken low and firm, the temp is never to touch that patient under any circumstances. Clear. Margot had nodded. Margot had been a friend, once. Now Margot looked away when Rachel passed. The official calls to the nursing board had started on day 4. Caldwell's voice on the voicemail, I'm filing concerns about scope of practice violations. The temp nurse may have overstepped during the last critical episode. There had been no episode. But the board would investigate. The board always did. Rachel pushed her medication cart down the linoleum corridor toward rooms 412 through 418. 6 patients. Routine medications. Blood pressure checks. The kind of work that kept the hospital running and kept nurses like Rachel invisible. She'd served for 12 years before this, run triage operations in Bagram where she made decisions that meant the difference between the operating tent and the body bag. She'd held together a field hospital during the siege of FOB Shank with shrapnel in her left shoulder and the weight of 63 lives depending on her next correct decision. Now she distributed ibuprofen and checked vital signs on elderly men with prostate issues and women recovering from routine surgery. The work was important. The work was necessary. The work was also designed to keep her far from Emma Reeves. But observation windows existed for a reason. On day 6 of the reassignment, Rachel had positioned herself at the supply cart near the corner room and watched Emma through the glass for 90 seconds while pretending to inventory 4 bags. The girl's skin had taken on a grayish pallor that wasn't simple anemia. Not jaundice, that would show in the sclera first, in the whites of the eyes. This was different. This was the color of tissue beginning to reject something it couldn't process, the body's quiet protest registering in tone and texture before organs began to fail. Rachel had seen it once before. 3 years before, in a trauma tent in Bagram, in a specialist who'd come to help after the attack on the supply convoy. A young doctor, brilliant hands, brought in with shrapnel wounds and what looked like ordinary allergic reaction. Swelling, rash, the kind of thing that happened when blast trauma complicated immune response. But the timing had been wrong. The symptoms had progressed in the wrong sequence. The foreport they'd placed, a central line with a nickel-based alloy catheter, had been the culprit. The body had spent 2 days trying to tell them something was poisoning it while they treated the symptoms instead of the source. The doctor had survived because Major Rachel Torres had been running triage that day and had seen the pattern everyone else had missed. She'd pulled the port. They'd switched to titanium. 72 hours later, the swelling had begun to recede. 15 doctors at Seattle General had reviewed Emma's case. Brilliant physicians. Oncologists. Pediatric specialists. All of them looking at white blood counts and chemotherapy efficacy and missing what combat medical technician Torres had learned in a tent where you had to diagnose by instinct because you didn't have time for second opinions. The port they'd placed in Emma was standard equipment. Nickel-based alloy. Standard. Used on thousands of patients every year. And if a child happened to have the rare genetic predisposition to metal allergy, the kind of thing you might only discover when that metal was being pumped directly into her bloodstream, nobody would connect it until the organ started failing. Until it was too late. Rachel had reviewed Emma's childhood medical records from the file system. Pediatric allergies section, page 4, buried beneath the more recent oncology notes, metal sensitivity noted in comprehensive immunology panel, age 4. Recommend non-ferrous medical equipment. Pediatrician note, Emma shows reaction to nickel jewelry, recommend avoiding nickel-based medical devices. Documented. Clear. Specific. Recommended. Missed by 15 doctors. The chart review had taken her 7 minutes. She'd done it during a bathroom break on day 9 when she ducked into the medical records office and logged in using credentials she was technically no longer authorized to use. Another violation. Another reason to surface, to get noticed, to break the rules that kept her buried. Rachel had not gone back into that system. Instead, she had continued pushing her medication cart and watching from observation windows and feeling the dog tag beneath her scrubs, the one on the broken chain, the one that carried the engraved name of a man who had died in the same operation that had erased Rachel Torres from every military database. The one that had turned a major into a temp nurse. She touched it now, her fingers finding the cool metal through cotton scrubs as she finished her floor rounds at 6:27 p.m. The weight of it was familiar. The engraved name was a frequency she'd learned to feel in darkness. The rain had started 3 hours ago. By the time Rachel had finished her shift and changed out of her scrubs, it was falling in sheets that hammered the parking lot like applause for something nobody wanted to witness. Her motorcycle was a Kawasaki, reliable, fast, the kind of vehicle that didn't require paperwork or background checks because she paid in cash. It smelled like oil and rain and the particular cold that came from riding through December without protection. The cemetery was 14 minutes north of the hospital. She'd been there on the anniversary each year since she'd been placed in the program, and twice more when the weight of staying alive had outweighed the weight of staying hidden. Her husband's grave sat beneath an oak tree that had grown twisted by wind, and the headstone read only, Marcus Torres, beloved husband, 1987 to 2017. No rank. No unit. No medals. Just the name and the years and a blank space where their life together had been. Rachel knelt in the mud. Rain soaked through her jeans instantly, cold and penetrating, and she didn't move. She touched the stone with hands that had performed emergency procedures in field hospitals and now distributed ibuprofen to old men with prostate issues. Hands that had once been called Major Torres. Hands that had held her husband's hand for the last time in a trauma tent when the wounds had been too extensive and the blood loss too complete. I broke cover for nothing, baby, she whispered. The rain hammered harder. They're still going to let that little girl die, and I can't stop them. The dog tag felt heavier than it should have. Cold against her chest. A frequency of grief and rage and the particular helplessness of watching something you could fix while being ordered to let it break. Emma Reeves had 8 days left, maybe 10. That's how long it took for cumulative nickel toxicity to shut down a small body's system. Rachel had seen the numbers. She had run the timeline. She had done the math that nobody else was bothering to do because 15 doctors had already decided the case was solved and the girl was simply losing her battle with cancer instead of poisoning with a treatable cause. Caldwell had made sure Rachel couldn't reach her. New door codes. Reassigned badge clearance. Instructions explicit and documented. If Rachel entered that ICU room, if she touched that patient or that equipment, she would be breaking direct orders. She would be violating the restriction. She would be surfacing. And surfacing meant the witnesses would come. The classified briefings would end. The new name and the new life would burn away like paper in a fire. She would have to testify about Bagram, about the equipment contractor, about the supplies that had been purchased through a vendor with connections to people who would rather see her dead than see her speak under oath. The military had ordered her to disappear. Officially, Major Rachel Torres had died in a transport accident. The woman kneeling in the rain at a grave with only a first name on the stone didn't exist in any system. She was no one. She was safe because she was nobody. And in room 412 of Seattle General, Emma Reeves was turning gray from the inside out while 15 doctors watched and waited for her body to give up. Rachel pressed her forehead against the rain-soaked stone. The name was carved so deep the letters would outlast everyone who remembered him. Marcus had been SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. He had known how to make impossible choices. He had known how to accept that some prices couldn't be negotiated. The rain continued. The cemetery remained empty except for the dead and the woman kneeling in the mud, touching a dog tag that no one was supposed to know she wore, whispering to a man who had learned the cost of doing what was right. She didn't cry. Tears were information, and information could be traced, could create patterns, could get people noticed. Instead, she breathed through the grief like she had breathed through the shrapnel wound in Bagram, one calculated inhale, one measured exhale, the body's discipline overriding the heart's demand for release. By the time she rose from the mud, it was 7:34 p.m. The rain showed no sign of stopping. The motorcycle ride back to the apartment would take 16 minutes if she obeyed the speed limits. 12 if she didn't. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that Emma Reeves was in isolation on the ICU, connected to equipment that was slowly poisoning her while brilliant doctors watched the wrong numbers climb. What mattered was that Rachel had proven she could disappear so completely that even her own military had written her death as fact. The real question was whether she could choose to come back into the light before that little girl's body forgot how to breathe. They didn't know who they were firing. At 2:13 a.m. on a Tuesday night, Emma Reeves' body began betraying her in ways that 15 doctors had somehow missed. Her throat was closing. Not from infection. Not from the cancer they'd been poisoning out of her for 6 weeks. From the titanium port they'd been pumping chemotherapy through since day one. The metal allergy that lived in her childhood medical records, the ones nobody had bothered to cross-reference with the for access they selected. She didn't know it was anaphylaxis. She only knew that breathing was becoming a luxury she could no longer afford. The on-call residents froze in her ICU room like statues in a burning building, staring at the monitor as her oxygen saturation dropped, 92, 87, 79, 71. One of them reached for an airway kit with hands that trembled like aspen leaves. Another stood completely motionless, watching a child die on his watch while his brain searched for protocols that didn't exist yet. The alarm screamed. The ventilator wasn't going to help because the swelling wasn't in her lungs. It was in her throat. It was in the space between her vocal cords where flesh was beginning to swell shut like a drowning victim rising from deep water. The ICU doors burst open with enough force that a security guard stumbled backward. Rachel Torres moved through that room like muscle memory made flesh, like Bagram had never actually left her bones. She didn't run. Running suggested panic. She walked to Emma's bedside with the economy of motion that comes from doing emergency triage in a field hospital where every gesture counted as training, where hesitation meant someone's child didn't come home. The residents parted without being asked because her voice had already changed. It had dropped an octave. It had become something that wasn't a request anymore. Anaphylaxis. Titanium port. Remove it now. Her hands were already moving, reaching for the crash cart, locating the scalpel, her fingers finding the ballpoint pen from the nurse's station with the precision of someone who had improvised surgical tools in worse conditions than a hospital full of equipment. The resident who'd been frozen finally moved, fumbling with the port access line. Rachel positioned the scalpel at the cricothyroid membrane, that soft depression in the throat between the cricoid and thyroid cartilage where you could access the airway below the swelling. 15 seconds. Her hands didn't shake. They never shook. The scalpel went through skin and membrane with the same steady pressure she'd used on a 19-year-old Marine with a shrapnel wound through his trachea and nothing but field kit to work with. She pressed the plastic casing from the ballpoint pen into the opening she'd created, forming a makeshift airway that would let oxygen bypass the swelling completely. Epinephrine 0.3 mg intramuscular. Benadryl 50 mg for push. Remove that port and flush the line with normal saline. The residents moved like they'd suddenly remembered how to be soldiers instead of civilians playing dress-up in white coats. One of them pushed the epinephrine while another worked the port out of Emma's arm. The line flushed. Rachel kept her hand steady on the improvised airway, monitoring placement, watching the monitor like it was the only thing in the world that existed. Oxygen saturation began climbing. 76. 82. 88. 94. Color returned to Emma's lips, that faint pink that means blood is moving again, that the body hasn't given up yet. The child's chest rose and fell in a rhythm that wasn't controlled by machine anymore. It was controlled by her own lungs remembering how to work. Rachel was checking the airway placement when she heard Dr. Caldwell's voice materialize behind her like a curse made audible. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His tone suggested he was looking at a contamination event, not a saved life. He surveyed the scene, the pen casing airway, the removed titanium port sitting on the sterile field like evidence of a crime, Emma's oxygen monitor ticking upward, the child breathing normally for the first time in 6 hours. His face went white. Then it went purple. The kind of rage that comes when someone realizes they're about to lose control of a narrative. Rachel didn't turn around. She continued monitoring Emma's airway placement, her hands steady as surgical lasers, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing fear register anywhere on her face. Within 3 minutes, Dr. Caldwell was on his phone with hospital administration. His voice echoed down the corridor, loud enough that staff in the next unit could hear him describing flagrant violations, practicing medicine without a license, immediate security intervention. Within 10 minutes, 2 security officers appeared at the ICU entrance with the apologetic expressions of men who'd been given uncomfortable orders. Dr. Caldwell physically positioned himself between Rachel and Emma's bedside. The move was deliberate. Tactical. He was creating a barrier, ensuring that no ICU staff member could corroborate what had just happened, that nobody could testify they'd watched a temp nurse perform a life-saving emergency procedure while the department's leadership watched a child's oxygen saturation drop into the danger zone without intervening. She practiced medicine without a license, Caldwell said to the administrators, his voice dripping with wounded authority. "I want her badge revoked. I want her access terminated immediately. And I'm calling the state nursing board before she reaches the parking lot." It wasn't a request. It was a command spoken by someone accustomed to rooms full of people who obeyed. Rachel handed over her badge without a word. The laminated rectangle with her temp status and her generic hospital photo, the nurse nobody had bothered to notice for 3 weeks, went into an administrator's trembling hand. She took one measured breath. Just one. The security guard's grip on her elbow was firm but not cruel. He was just doing his job. She understood that. She'd done jobs she wasn't proud of too. They walked through the ICU together, past nurses who couldn't meet her eyes, past the room where Emma Reeves was breathing normally through a pen casing airway because the 15 doctors on her case had missed something obvious. Rachel didn't look back. Her composure didn't crack. Her jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't tremble. The timid temp nurse walked out of Seattle General with her head level and her pace even, while behind her, Dr. Caldwell watched from the ICU entrance with his arms crossed like a general surveying conquered territory. But that wasn't the worst part. That night, at 11:53 p.m., Rachel Torres knelt at her late husband's grave in Jacksonville Memorial Cemetery, rain hammering down like applause for a tragedy nobody wanted to watch. The grass was soaked through. Her scrubs were soaked through. The broken chain with his dog tag hung beneath her shirt, that single piece of metal that proved she'd once belonged to something bigger than fear. The matching dog tag from his SEAL deployment in 2018. The one that had been classified as remains unidentified in the transport accident that officially killed them both. She didn't touch the headstone. She just knelt there in the mud with her hands open at her sides, and she whispered words that the rain immediately erased. "I broke cover for nothing, baby. They're still going to let that little girl die, and I can't stop them." Her voice didn't crack. It didn't tremble. It was steady and level and absolutely hollow, the voice of someone who'd learned long ago that the cost of staying hidden was that you had to watch people suffer and do nothing. The cost of coming out of hiding was that you still failed anyway. Either way, people died. Either way, you went home alone. She stayed there until dawn began breaking over the cemetery, her knees embedded in mud, her hands still open, believing absolutely that she'd condemned a child with her choice. Believing that the best thing she could do now was fade back into nothing, let Major Rachel Torres settle back into the classified database as officially deceased, let the temp nurse disappear like morning fog. But in the ICU at Seattle General, Emma Reeves was breathing normally through a makeshift airway created by someone whose hands had learned steadiness in a place where failure meant body bags. And 72 hours later, everything was about to change. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reeves arrived stateside 72 hours after his daughter stopped seizing. He was still wearing his combat uniform, sand still embedded in the stitching from a forward operating base 7,000 miles away, when he pushed through the ICU doors and found Emma sitting up in bed, color returning to her small face like watercolor bleeding back into bleached paper. His boots hit the linoleum floor with the precise rhythm of a man trained to move through hostile territory. The first thing he did wasn't embrace his daughter. The first thing he did was find the charge nurse station and ask one question with the kind of quiet authority that made every head in the ICU turn toward him: "Who saved my daughter when your 15 specialists didn't?" The room went still. Emma's eyes opened wider, and she looked directly at her father with the clarity of a child who'd spent 3 days floating between consciousness and the edge of something darker. "Major Rachel," she said clearly, reading the name aloud from a scrap of memory, the words Rachel had whispered when she thought Emma was unconscious, when her hands were moving on their own, when she was trusting muscle memory that hadn't faded in 3 years of hiding. "Her name is Major Rachel. She told me to stay still while she fixed the thing that was choking me. She smelled like rain and coffee and something sharp, like metal. And she said my daddy was a good man and that good men raise strong daughters." A floor nurse named Jennifer, 26 years old, third-year RN, the kind of person who paid attention to details because details saved lives, felt something crack open in her chest. She pulled Rachel's emergency hire file with trembling hands and watched it flag classified security clearance codes that existed in databases she'd never been authorized to access. The kind of codes that appeared in federal witness protection documentation. The kind of clearance that didn't belong to a temporary nursing agency employee making $16 an hour. Jennifer's fingers hovered over her keyboard. She forwarded that file to every person in the administrative conference room with a single line of text: "You need to see this before you finalize termination paperwork." Within an hour, the administrative conference room at Seattle General filled with people who rarely occupied the same space. The hospital CEO. The chief medical officer. The risk management director. And then the doors opened again, and a man in navy dress blue stepped through, a SEAL team leader with scars visible on his neck and eyes that had seen things that never left. He wasn't accompanied by Marcus Reeves. He was accompanied by 6 other operators in civilian clothes, the kind of casual tactical wear that screamed Federal Alphabet Agency to anyone who knew how to read it. One of them was carrying a laptop. Dr. Caldwell stood when they entered, his confidence still intact because he didn't yet understand that competence stops mattering once you're standing in front of someone with genuine authority. "I'm not sure what the issue is here," he began, his voice carrying the smooth certainty of a man who'd never been interrupted in a boardroom. "I made a difficult personnel decision regarding a temp nurse who attempted to practice medicine outside her scope of." The SEAL team leader's voice cut through like a blade through tissue. "You fired the woman who held together a field hospital during the Bagram siege. The same woman who triaged casualties from an IED strike while rocket fire was incoming. She didn't flinch then, and she didn't flinch when she read your arrogance off your face 3 days ago. He let that sit for a moment. The sound of air conditioning hummed overhead, but underneath it was the weight of what he wasn't saying. Then he continued, Major Rachel Torres earned 2 silver stars and a bronze star with Valor. One of those silver stars came from keeping 47 wounded soldiers alive for 18 hours with a field thoracotomy, a combat knife, and blood type O running through full lines she constructed from field rations. You were in private practice. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass, and Caldwell's face went the color of old bone. An FBI agent stepped forward, his suit tailored in that specific federal way that made it clear he'd attended a briefing that morning. Major Torres was placed in witness protection following her classified testimony about equipment failures at Bagram that resulted in the deaths of 7 soldiers. The same equipment failures that involved your current supply contractor, Hexagon Medical Supply, who was providing substandard titanium port components that were never adequately stress-tested for pediatric applications. The agent's voice was conversational, almost friendly, which made it somehow more devastating. We've been investigating Dr. Caldwell's financial relationship with Hexagon Medical for 18 months. It turns out you've been receiving $12,000 quarterly for consulting services while exclusively ordering their titanium-based chemotherapy ports that cost 3 times the equivalent generic alternative and just happen to be contraindicated for patients with documented metal allergies. Caldwell's hands began to shake. Rachel would have recognized that shake. It was the tremor that came right before the moment someone understood they'd made a catastrophic error in reading the room. I have documentation, he started, but the words came out thin and hollow. A man in civilian clothes with a prosthetic leg below the right knee stepped forward, his movement fluid in the way that came from relearning how to move your entire body. His name was Cooper, and he'd been a Marine Corps systems administrator before an IED took his leg at Marja in Helmand Province. Now he ran IT for Seattle General, and he'd watched the security footage alerts on his dashboard while he was working late the night Rachel saved Emma. No documentation covers this, Cooper said flatly, extending a tablet toward the CEO. I watched Dr. Caldwell access the security system at 11:22 p.m. and attempt 3 separate deletions of the hallway footage from the night Major Torres performed an emergency cricothyrotomy to save a patient he'd been prescribing titanium ports to despite a documented pediatric metal allergy. Cooper's voice was the voice of someone who'd learned precision in an active combat zone. I'd already backed up every frame. To an external server. And to the State Medical Board. I also pulled Dr. Caldwell's email correspondence with Hexagon Medical. 23 emails over 4 years. Emails discussing which hospitals would be the most receptive to their product lines and which competitors' drugs could be gradually phased out through exclusive purchasing agreements. The room became the kind of quiet you could operate in. Caldwell's chair scraped backward as he stood, looking for an exit, but Marcus Reeves was now standing in the doorway with his operators, and the message in their posture was clear: nobody was leaving. The SEAL team leader pulled a single document from a folder and placed it face up on the table. Emma's childhood medical records are on file. Metal allergy documented here, page 6, from a reaction to costume earrings at age 4. All 15 of your specialists had access to that file. None of them read past page 1. Your temp nurse did. Your temp nurse, who you demoted and terminated, read what 15 board-certified physicians missed because she was trained to see what panic makes other people skip over. An arrest warrant landed on the table like a playing card in a game that had suddenly changed rules. The FBI agent slid it across with one finger. Dr. Richard Caldwell, you're under investigation for Medicare fraud, accepting illegal kickbacks from a medical device manufacturer, and obstruction of justice. Your medical license is suspended pending investigation. You have the right to remain silent. Security guards entered, the same 2 men who'd escorted Rachel from the hospital 3 days earlier, and Rachel would later learn that they'd both gone to their supervisor that same evening and asked why they were removing a woman for saving a child's life while keeping a doctor who poisoned profit margins over patient welfare. We're done, one of them said simply, gesturing Caldwell toward the door. The walk from the conference table to the exit took 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, Dr. Richard Caldwell's life became a different shape. His hand shook. His breathing changed. His certainty evaporated like rain on hot asphalt. 6 months later, the shape of Rachel's life had changed too, but in the opposite direction, like someone had finally turned on the lights in a room she'd been living in darkness. She stood in Emma Reeves' backyard in Jacksonville, watching the 8-year-old run through a sprinkler in the afternoon heat, her hair growing back in dark curls, her laugh carrying the specific joy of a child who'd learned to breathe without pain. Marcus Reeves handed her a leather case containing a chief nursing officer badge. The hospital board had insisted, had demanded, had made it a condition of her security clearance reinstatement that she accept a position of authority, though she'd negotiated to keep her shift work in direct patient care because that was where she'd learned to see what mattered. Through the kitchen window, she could see the hospital in the distance, its emergency lights visible even in daylight. A figure in a grey security guard uniform walked past the emergency entrance, pushing a cleaning cart toward the employee parking lot for the night shift. Dr. Caldwell. 27 months into his conviction for Medicare fraud and obstruction of justice, his medical license permanently revoked, 18 other patients identified whose cases had been shaped by his financial incentives rather than their clinical needs. The state medical board had found he'd prescribed unnecessary chemotherapy rounds to 11 cancer patients and recommended untested drug combinations to another 7, all while receiving quarterly payments from Hexagon Medical. The hospital had settled lawsuits. Insurance companies had filed countersuits. His name was now a case study in medical ethics courses as an example of how institutional bias and financial incentives could corrupt judgment in ways that looked reasonable from the inside. Emma ran over to Rachel, breathless and brilliant, and grabbed both her hand and her father's. "Can Major Rachel stay for cake?" The question was asked with the casual certainty of a child who'd learned that some people stay, that some promises hold, that some people choose to see you completely. Marcus looked at Rachel, at the woman who'd broken her own cover and sacrificed her carefully constructed invisibility to save his daughter, and she was already nodding. "I'm not going anywhere," Rachel said quietly. The dog tag beneath her shirt moved against her skin as she breathed, her husband's name now visible on the chain she wore openly, no longer hidden. 3 years of silence ended. 3 years of staying small and still and unseen. All of it ended the moment Emma Reeves' oxygen saturation dropped and Rachel's hands remembered what they'd been trained to do. As the sun moved lower and the backyard filled with neighbors and colleagues and people who were beginning to know Rachel as something other than a temp nurse, she watched Caldwell's distant figure empty trash bins and move through the shadows of the parking lot. She thought about the briefings in Bagram, about the 7 soldiers she couldn't save despite everything, about the matching dog tag her husband wore and the 3 years she'd worn his dog tag hidden beneath her scrubs like a secret that might break her if she acknowledged it too fully. But it hadn't broken her. The weight of it had shaped her, had taught her how to move through the world quietly, how to see what others missed, how to hold other people's lives in her hands like they were the most sacred thing she'd ever touched. Emma tugged her toward the house, toward cake and candles and the kind of ordinary happiness that Rachel had thought was gone from her life forever. As they walked, she passed the kitchen window one more time and caught her reflection next to Marcus and Emma. She didn't look like someone who'd been hiding. She looked like someone who'd been waiting for the moment when hiding was no longer necessary. The badge in her pocket was cold against her ribs, solid proof that the world could sometimes be reordered toward justice, that people could see you completely and decide you were worth keeping, that sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Like this video if you think she made the right call. But was the punishment enough? Or did he deserve worse? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe and hit that bell.